worked in different businesses, different industries, different parts of the world even. And so I think, you know, this new normal scenario has played out in some other situations that I've been in. And what I wanted to do today is really hopefully give you some tools, some thoughts, some ideas, some things to think about with your business as you start to get ready to reopen. Without having the benefit of knowing who's on the call. If you've been a business that have already been opened, because you might have been in the essential businesses or you were able to already get started, this might also be an opportunity for you to just do a little bit of a check-in with some of the ideas that we've got and maybe apply them to your business. So I'm going to make it as hands-on as I can and also as practical as I can. So with that, I'm going to just get started. Except I don't seem to be able to get my screen to move now. Let me just double check what's going on here.
It doesn't want to let you transition slides?
Yeah, it's not letting me transition my slides where it was before. So I apologize, folks. We were doing a little checks before we started. And I haven't touched anything, so I don't know why it's doing that now.
Do you want to go out of your PowerPoint and try coming back in and seeing, or turn the share screen off and turn it back on maybe?
Yeah, let me just do that, see if that helps. Okay, so let me just start that again. Okay, let's see. Oh, perfect, that works. Okay, maybe it's just frozen. Okay, so in terms of today, we want to provide you with a framework and a plan to help you recover and open up your business under COVID-19. I'm going to talk about some of the legal obligations, just more for context. Some of the government directives, you've probably been seeing a lot of information coming out in the news, in the media around changes, you know, from the Ontario government. What needs to be considered to get your physical space and your employees ready for the reopening. And also talk about communications, things around employee communications, customer communications, suppliers and third parties, with a view that as you work your way through this today, can start to think about your business readiness checklist, we'll call it that, and also have a chance to share ideas and any lessons learned. So we're all working in the new normal. We're all in an unprecedented time for the business. It sort of goes without saying. And I think the reality is that we're kind of learning some of this stuff as we go. You'll see business that were open early on with some lessons learned that I think are getting applied through each of the new stages of reopening businesses as we go forward. But a couple of key things I think to keep in mind is obviously keeping up to date on information. Because the change is constant and evolving, and I have tried to make sure that for today, I've got information that's as current as today for the workshops. There actually were, the last couple of days, some recent changes in Ontario, and we'll get to that a little later. Continuously review your business and your markets. I mean, I think while there's been a lot of maybe downside and negative, obviously surrounding COVID-19 from a business perspective, and a lot of challenges, there's also potential new opportunities. So I think it's also being agile and adaptable, and I think everybody's capable and is already doing that, which is great. But I think that's going to be something we'll be seeing a lot, more of as we go forward. The other thing is keeping communications open and often, and that's involving all of your stakeholders. So we'll talk about employees, we'll talk about customers, we'll talk about third parties, and making sure that you're keeping your communications open. And I think the other big piece is in our lessons learned. I'm going to talk about something called business contingency planning. It's something I'm familiar with from businesses I've worked in previously, and it's something that you may want to sort of consider for your business. Okay. So let's just jump right into business readiness. And as we go through the series of slides that I've set up, hopefully, again, we're going to use this as an opportunity for you to start thinking about your business readiness, the things that you might want to consider in terms of getting your business ready for reopening. So hopefully you're familiar with this already, but the government of Ontario has a planned approach to reopening the businesses in 3 stages. And we've obviously gone through stage 1. Those are businesses that could open immediately, or the essential businesses, if you think back to essentials and non-essentials. And we're now in stage 2, where we're opening more workplaces, and we're doing that based on risk assessments. What I'm not going to do in the presentation, I think just in the interest of not sort of stalling and losing some time here, is you're going to see a series of links throughout the presentation, and those are going to take you directly to tools, materials, information, and hopefully things, again, that will be helpful for you as you start to look at your business. And one of the things the government talks is doing that risk assessment. Some of you may already be familiar with this from a business perspective. It's just really being able to ask the questions, understanding what degree of risk you may have within your organization, and then how are you going to be able to address that. And once you get those in place with some working solutions, this is where we start to talk about training and employee communications and the communication process. Okay. So this slide here is just, you know, we should make sure that businesses should only reopen if they are ready. And I think, you know, we're seeing maybe some stops and starts for folks, but the reality is we want to make sure businesses are ready, that they will open safely and protect the health and well-being of not only employees, but customers as well. And what's recently come up as of Friday, May 29th, I said I've tried to make sure this is as current as possible, is they're talking about potentially some regional reopening. I don't have a ton of information on that. I've been kind of looking through the news. You may have been reading about this as well. Hopefully you have. But as late as Friday, they're looking at potentially a regional approach. Clearly, when you look across the province, there are some areas in the province where they may be able to open a little sooner than other parts of the province. And so this is where the regional approach for staged reopening is going to take place. And again, I've provided a link if you want to sort of have a look of that. And also each sector within the province of Ontario has been given guidelines for reopening. So this slide here talks to this first step really in terms of determining whether or not your business is ready to reopen, and what are some of the things you need to be considering. So clearly, if we look at this from a checklist perspective, are you in that category of business that's been identified as one that can reopen? You know, can all aspects of the physical premises or business be opened and operate in a safe and a controlled manner? Or do you have to consider stages? If we think about what we've seen so far, restaurants, for example, if we have any restaurant folks that are on the phone, you know, then clearly they've been able to open part of their business. They can open for takeout and delivery, but not necessarily for dine-in. So that's also a consideration when you're looking at your business. When we talk about consulting, some businesses, depending on the size, may have a joint health and safety committee, or you may be a solopreneur or a smaller organization that doesn't have one. But the message here really is around making sure that you are also reaching out to other individuals that may be able to help you as part of that reopening assessment that you would need to do. So I've just listed some of them there. And then what are some of the criteria that are being used to make the decision to reopen? Obviously, we're looking at public health, the ability to meet health and safety requirements, maybe there's supply chain challenges, definitely around employee and workforce availability and readiness. So again, these are all things that from the non-essential business under stage 2 assessment that employers are being asked to take a look at. And one of the other things is that you should be looking as well under the Ontario stage reopening for your sector, what some of the guidelines are. And again, there's a link that I've included in there for you to take a look at your particular business within your sector within Ontario, and you'll see in there some guidelines, you know, for example, construction or manufacturing or food processing. So I always like to sort of throw this out there just in terms of, you know, there is a risk, right? If we open businesses before they're ready, you just need to be aware as a business owner that there are potential risks and liabilities. if businesses are found to not be in compliance with the government orders. There was an update recently under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. Again, I've provided a link there, which gives greater authority, for want of a better word, to the government in terms of spaces they could close, for example, public or private spaces being closed, restricting travel and movement within the province, given the gravity or the significance of the emergency situation, in this case, COVID-19. So as a consequence, you know, if people are found to be in violation of that, there can be individual fines up to 100,000 and corporations up to 10 million, 500,000 for directors, and obviously there are also potential time in jail if you're found to be not in compliance. I mean, we've not seen anything like that yet. We've certainly heard of situations in local municipalities or local towns and cities where, you know, there's been a gathering before. You know, we're obviously able to gather in large numbers. I think if people have read the news, they might have heard some of the stuff went down in sort of Brampton area. And there are still potential bylaws within local jurisdictions that you might need to be aware of as well, in terms of potential fines for not being in compliance. And also, and these are always in place, there is, you know, risk as well if under federal occupational health and safety legislation, should there be any sort of injury or illness, which also has its own set of fines that potentially come up under that area. So not to put the sort of fear of, you know, I'm going to get fined. I think it's just an awareness of the fact that there are guidelines, there are expectations, and there are things to be considering when you look to reopen your business, and just making sure that you're in compliance. And part of that risk assessment and putting a plan in place is going to help you mitigate and manage that, and hopefully open without any issues at all. So again, throughout the presentation, I'm including some helpful links here. The Government of Canada link is going to show you what the latest thinking is around COVID-19. And also Government of Ontario, that link there will also allow you to access information from the Government of Ontario for various things related to COVID-19. I have included in this slide about consulting with your COVID-19 response team. And what I mean by that is basically that if your business is large enough, again, you may have decided to put an actual team together to work on putting your response to COVID-19. If you're a smaller business, for example, it may just be you or another business owner, which is perfectly fine. It's just, again, highlighting the fact that there are you know, others that you can involve as part of your reopening plans, as well as accessing lots of great information, quite frankly, from the government at a federal or provincial level. So as we start to go through the next set of slides, this is really going to talk to planning and preparing to reopen. So this hopefully becomes and starts to become part of that readiness planning and assessment, so that you can walk through your business and take into consideration things that you may need to modify or adjust in order to follow directives, be compliant, and ensure that you have a safe, you know, operating, you know, you can safely operate under COVID-19. Okay, I'll move through this one. So when you're looking at your business, if you haven't already done so, really looking at physical space, and we'll talk more on each of these areas, but I sort of put them into 5 buckets. Your business policy review and changes that you may also need to make based on some of the changes that you're having to make in your business to reopen. Your employees and the number of things we need to be considering for employees, and we'll spend a bit of time on that. Third parties, communications, and again, always with the view that we're reopening safely and responsibly. So let's talk about physical space. And again, you know, your businesses, I'm sure, are all very different and unique. but are most likely, you know, in some form of physical space in terms of how you operate. And so really walking that physical space and getting a good understanding of where you may have some risk as part of that assessment would be one of the things that you need to do. So we're looking at access to physical space, physical setup, cleaning and sanitizing schedule, as well as looking at PPE. So we'll drill down into these in a little more detail. And again, what we're doing today, hopefully, is just walking you through the process of thinking through your business front to back end as you sort of start to think about reopening and getting ready for reopening, so that you do that in a manner that allows you, in a sense, to do it once and not have to sort of go back and revisit areas. So here are some things to consider for building, for your building access. So thinking about controlling access points, whether you directly or indirectly control them, would be another question. You know, do you need to be speaking to a landlord or property management? Do you need to get some form of common understanding or agreement across individuals that may also use the building, as well as signage? And then whatever communications you'd need to do for any of the changes need to be sent or distributed or managed across all of the different parties. So you step back and you look at your business and you think about, you know, how are people going to actually, how do they currently access my business, and how can we manage that? So you may want to look at restricting access. Can you create a single point of entry? Can you designate in and outs? Do you need to put in some sort of a security check? Do you need to look at swipe keys? One of the risk areas that they call out in the link that I've included here is around bottlenecks. Think about your business in terms of people moving through the organization or moving through the property, and whether you might inadvertently have bottlenecks where, you know, too many people would gather or potentially come together at one point. And the risk there, of course, is that, you know, they talk about these respiratory droplets, which is, you know, how COVID-19 is getting transmitted. And so can you take a look at access for these types of areas and find ways to reduce or eliminate the potential for that? Stairwells and elevators. I mean, I've been in buildings where there's signage, you know, certainly limiting people to the usage, but consider those types of things. You need to look at your policies and procedures, and this is going to be true for the different areas, and also when we get into the employees section, you know, making sure that you are communicating any changes or providing any training of any changes if you're going to set up different ways to access the building, or you're going to limit access, etc. Screening protocols. Are you going to put in place any type of screening protocol? I know early on, and you probably also found the same thing, some businesses were asking before you went in whether or not you had been out of the country, have you been in quarantine, are you suffering any kind of fever, etc. I've not been into physical building at this point. It's probably more in the essential businesses like nursing homes, where they may even actually do temperature checking. From a health and safety perspective, clearly you can look at putting in protocols requiring people to either self-identify or do some sort of data capture, but you need to be aware of privacy laws. You need to ensure that any information that you do capture as part of this reopening process, as part of your check for your business, is managed, you know, in a confidential manner, so that you don't get yourself into any issues with that. But you may want to consider, as part of the access process now, having some sort of a screening protocol. Obviously, use of technology that would limit the need for access altogether. And we've seen businesses that have been able to do that. They can work from home, or they can reorganize their business in such a way that there really isn't a need for people to even come on site. And so, Public Health Ontario has talked about, a layering effect in terms of managing for COVID-19. So reducing the number of direct contacts or impacts that you can have between people in your business, as well as increasing the exposure to safety protocols and safety procedures. So if you think about, the best one would be people aren't working in the office, if that was possible for your business, or very limited exposure and need to be in the office, versus you're in the office and having to look at those safety protocols that you put in place. And they start with, the physical access, who's coming in and out, how are they coming in and out, and making sure that people are clear and have been trained and communicated on how that's going to work. Also consider your delivery areas, whether you have pickups and drop-offs from third parties, thinking about how third parties are going to be interacting with your business, and making sure that in those instances you are also limiting that potential exposure and risk for an individual. And then what about refusal to follow some screening protocols? We've seen videos on, certainly not here, I think they've been more down in the States, but, where individuals want to come onto the premise or property of a company and they don't want to follow protocol. They don't want to wear a mask if that's something that's been implemented. I'll use Costco as the example. If you've seen that video where the individual comes into the store has implemented a process of wearing a mask for customers. This customer doesn't want to wear the mask, and so the sales associate who is masked basically doesn't allow them access to their business. So you need to be thinking about, not only people following protocol, but if people aren't going to follow protocol, are you ready? Have you thought through how you might be able to manage that? And the underlying point here as well is you need to consider any health and safety requirements. For example, emergency evacuation, if you're going to limit access points, etc. Don't forget, if you had to evacuate the building for whatever reason, that you've not created any other issues for yourself when you've rethought through the access aspect. So now we'll move into physical readiness. This is important. And even though I'm not necessarily directly talking to employees, from a psychological and an employee sort of, feeling comfortable in the workplace, they want to know that you have walked through your business, you have considered the risks, you have done an assessment, you have put in place things that will make that work environment safe for your employees, yourself, your customers, any third parties that are coming in. So the physical setup is likely to be one of the more challenging ones depending upon the nature of your business. So things like workstations and seating, we obviously have this link talks to physical distancing. So we have a 2 meter or a 6 foot, a 6 foot physical distancing requirement as best practice. Are you able to actually do that? Do you need to think about how you set up your workstations to allow for that kind of physical distancing? And then what might be the knock-on effects from that? Things like communal areas, where people historically, come together and gather, reception areas, coffee stations. Are you going to be able to limit the numbers? Do you need to think about scheduling, meeting rooms, things where people potentially, are going to come together in numbers? You're going to need to think about how you set those up and how you manage them going forward. Traffic flow is another area for sort of the checklist. Take a look at your traffic flow, walk the floor, understand how the work, if you will, travels through the organization, meaning do people hand off materials or goods or they could be documents, for example, from one department to another. Maybe you need to redirect how that traffic flow is going to work, or potentially create drop-off zones, right? So one department comes out of one part of the workplace, and they would bring work, maybe their files, et cetera, to another, and they would leave them in such a way. And again, protocols of hand sanitizing, PPEs, we'll talk about those as well, but just making sure that you are looking at how things move through your business and whether or not you need to make changes to how things are being transferred from one spot to another. Whether or not you need to add in sneeze guards or some other kind of protective barrier so that you're reducing the risk of contact. So that may involve, we've been into grocery stores, I'm sure all of us by now, and clearly we've got sneeze guards. There are guards over terminals to be able to do your payments. You may have similar types of equipment in your business. There may also be things like photocopiers, shared filing cabinets, supply rooms, etc. So really taking a look at your business and understanding how people move through it. And this might be a great opportunity as well to engage your employees in a dialogue and discussion, depending on the size of your business. I mean, your employees are the ones, walking the floor on a regular basis, and they may have some really great ideas. So again, I don't want this to feel like it's just on management or one individual's shoulders. You could certainly get other people involved to help. And that's going to help also, certainly from an employee perspective, in terms of employee engagement and support, right? In terms of how you need to run your business going forward during COVID-19. Think about vending machines, drinking fountains, cutleries, cups, anything where people might come in contact. What about high touch areas? So door handles, light switches. Maybe you can prop open internal doors. Again, consider the health and safety risk for that, if there is any, but are there ways to limit the number of times door handles are being touched or light switches are being touched in order to, again, try and reduce the potential for COVID-19 to get transmitted. HVAC systems, these are your airflow, your heating, et cetera, type systems that push the air around the building. It may be worthwhile taking a look at how those systems are working and whether or not with some of the changes you're making in physical layout to take a look at those areas as well. And I think we touched on the slide previously about the outside space. So parking areas, drop-off areas, vendor delivery, customer spaces. Again, we've seen outside stores, with the 6-foot markers, but really just thinking through how things will move around your business if you have a business, and you can't just have everybody work from home. Where obviously you would eliminate a lot of this stuff, but you may need to think about, as you reopen, how people are going to be able to move and things will move through your business. Okay. Cleaning. So again, as we're going through this, this is intended for you to be thinking about your business. And if you've already, as I said, been open, it may just be an opportunity to do a little bit of a re-walk through or a rethink. There may be some lessons you've learned already, things that you would do a little differently, because we've learned as we've gone through COVID-19, we've seen things changing over the last few months as we've gone in and out of businesses already, where there weren't guards, now there are guards, so there might be some lessons learned. When we're talking about cleaning, how are you going to provide employees? It might be a very simple thing to think about, but are you going to have enough masks or gloves or hand sanitizer? Do you share space with another business? And, do you need to consider anything related to that? How will you make sure that you're going to have an adequate supply? In the early stages of COVID-19, clearly there were concerns around supplies, being able to have enough of the right type, et cetera, and approved types of supplies. And so, I think those things have probably gotten better, but you may need to consider how you make sure you've got a good supply of things. Not sure if your business needs to be deep cleaned. I mean, that could be a very, very deep, almost a steam type, some businesses may require very deep cleaning. Do you have currently a proper, the right cleaning schedule, meaning, do you need to clean more frequently? Do you need to clean differently? Again, you could talk to your cleaning company about this, if they provide that service for you, and also ask whether your cleaning company is going to be ready for the added, maybe workload or volume or changes that you need to make in your business. There is something, I pulled up an interesting link here around Health Canada is actually working, just so you're aware of this, for disinfectant manufacturers on products that will actually help with the spread of COVID-19. I've been in a number of places. I think they're diluted, if I can say that. In some of them, they seem very liquidy versus gel. I'm certainly not an expert, I don't know, but I think, when we were struggling to get enough of the right product that can actually disinfect and do what it needs to do to sort of limit or kill off the COVID-19, there were a lot of products that were coming out there that may or may not actually have worked. And so there is that link that will also show you or be able to point you in the right direction for some products that you might want to consider getting in terms of being able to fight or stop the spread of COVID-19. And we've already touched about the high touch point areas when we talk about cleaning, but it's just a question of walking your business from sort of front to back and really asking yourself the questions. And these are just a few. There's a link previously on an assessment from Health Canada that has more questions, and the questions aren't limited as to what I've provided here. They're just intended to have you to start thinking about those critical areas of your business that you might need to rethink how those are going to operate or need to operate when you reopen. PPE. So, being aware, first of all, of what any, quote, new requirements, because clearly pre-COVID, you may have had in your business a requirement for PPE under health and safety. But now we're seeing in businesses where heretofore there may have not have been, there is a requirement for PPE. Again, the link previously that shows by sector and by business, what the government directives are, whether they are mandatory, voluntary, or not required. What's interesting is I've not found anything yet. I have been looking around this issue of face masks because you hear that one coming up quite frequently. There is nothing at the moment that I've found from the government of Ontario mandating face masks. Obviously, they are very much encouraged. They have been, they can reduce the amount of transference potentially of the COVID virus, but being aware of what's required would certainly be something you should be looking into. And again, there's a link there that can point you in the right direction. What about if PPE is not required? If you look at your business and say, well, we don't really need PPE, but the employee wants to bring in their own PPE, are you going to permit that? Are you going to, require, who's going to make that decision? In regards to PPE, what if an employee fails to wear it properly or an individual fails to wear it properly? Could the refusal be on the basis of a human rights ground? Although typically, and again, I don't know who we've got on the call, so if you've got any health and safety folks there, we may get into this in the Q&A. What I've seen in my experience is, generally speaking, health and safety usually takes the priority. But having said that, I mean, I think you need to look at the whole picture. But if somebody says they're not going to wear PPEs, how are you going to manage that? Is there a mechanism? And I use the word disciplinary action, but let's say corrective action, training, how would you manage that type of situation? The idea being, for today in this workshop is just how you get ahead of some of those issues as you're getting ready to open up your business and looking at your business from sort of a whole picture perspective. And then I've touched on it briefly, do employees need to be trained on the correct way to use or wear PPE how to follow PPE protocols. I mean, we go back to that supply question. I mean, how frequently are they going to be required to change or clean their PPE? And what are your mechanisms to make sure that that's actually happening? So it's, again, just allowing you that opportunity maybe to just think a little bit about a checklist, in a sense that, you know, based on these types of questions, you can start to think through what you need to do to get your business ready for reopening. Okay, I think we said at the beginning of the presentation, we could either take questions or we can, you know, we'll keep moving. I'm a little cautious because for some reason it doesn't seem to be letting me go up into the Q&A. So I do apologize if I'm not seeing that at the moment, but we
And Dave,
will.
if any come through, I can read them out loud to you. So
Okay,
far, there's
perfect.
none here, but yeah.
There's none at the moment?
No.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go into the second area, business policy review and changes, okay? So as you look through your business and you make the changes necessary, you think about physical access, you think about the physical space, you think about how work is going to need to move around your business, how you can reduce the touch points, making sure that you've got PPE, you understand what your obligations are based on your sector, based on the nature of your business, and you're thinking through all of those things. It may also require you to make changes to your business policies. The reason I highlight this, again, is because if you need to do training, if you need to talk with employees, you know, having updated your business policy and reviewing any of these changes is going to be important. So things like hours of operations. I think the biggest change is likely to be in your operating procedures. I don't know what everybody calls them or if you even have them, depending on your business, but things like work instructions, how we do the tasks and activities that we do. If they've changed, if there are new requirements, then you may need to make sure that you update that information. Maybe there isn't, and you need to have a hand sanitizing policy, a physical distancing policy, maybe changes around pickups and drop-offs. So this is really intended for you to think about, okay, how do we sort of capture this information, put it into writing so that when we get into training or when we have to have a conversation with someone around something, we have, you know, something that we can refer to that's been brought up to date with the changes that we've made. You may need to look at your business in terms of returns and exchanges. You know, I've heard questions being asked around what do we do with returned merchandise? You know, does it go into quarantine? Does it go back on the shelf? I mean, you may have had a procedure prior to handling returns. Maybe you need to take a look at that type of return and again, communicate both to employees and to customers how you're going to handle product and merchandise returns. Complaint handling may also need to be reviewed. One thing that I also put in here is signing and approval or authorization if your staffing is limited. So if you have to set up a work schedule because of physical distancing requirements, right, that limits the number of people you can have on site, you may also need to be considering that you have people with the right level of signing authority or approval and authorization. And if not, maybe you need to add that to somebody's work requirements or ensure you've got a mechanism so that things don't get held up because somebody's not on site with that approval, or how you're going to manage that if that is the case. Emergency procedures, evacuation and shutdown. Again, if you've reworked the physical layout and the floor space, making sure that from a health and safety perspective, any of your emergency procedures have been followed up. And then employment policies. Again, we'll get into it a little bit more when we talk about people, but changes to work and or employment practices. You know, so maybe we've had some shift changes, obviously temporary layoffs, you know, vacation scheduling. You know, if you're reopening and people have been off since March, you know, and you're going into a normally what would be your busy period, you know, you're going to need to manage those types of day-to-day employee questions. So just thinking through any of your policies, you know, that need to be reviewed or changed to reflect what you've done in your business. Okay, so let's jump into employees. So there's a number of areas here that I wanted to talk to, and I'm certainly open to questions as we go through this section. I've tried to keep it fairly high level, focus on the areas that I think you're going to see potentially more questions or potential issues come up from employees than perhaps pre-COVID-19. But again, I think, this area here, we can talk in more detail if we get into the Q&A. So recalls from layoff and return to work, modified work and work arrangements, okay? You may need to have made adjustments to how people are going to work in the office or working from home arrangements. And, there may need to be consideration whether any of these things that you've done might carry forward, even post reopening as you've looked at your business. We're going to talk about PPE, health and safety, particularly refusal of unsafe work, training, new policies and procedures similar to your work instructions, your business policy and procedure changes. You need to update your employment policies, and that may result in training and new work instructions. And I don't want to forget communications. So this graphic again is just intended to be sort of triggering some thinking around employees. So, you need to think about who and how you will recall, you're going to recall employees. So do you need to do a staggered approach? It may be that the way your business operates and the types of business tasks and activities that you have, and I'll use the restaurant example again. You might need your kitchen staff, and you may need somebody for cash. But from a dining hostess and servery roles that you might have in your business, at this point in time, under government directives, right, you may not be able to open that part of your business, but you still need to recall other individuals who have a role to do to come back into the business. So you may need to consider a staggered approach. And clearly it's going to be driven by your business needs. And, I think to ensure that you keep yourself out of the potential risk of somebody viewing this as unfair, that you do have a very fair and open process. And this goes back to the communication to employees. Again, since we've hit with COVID-19, I've talked to different clients, and in terms of how they're communicating and keeping their employees up to date is great. And it's important, to let employees know, where are we in this process? We were told to shut our business down in early March. And basically, we've been in this sort of hiatus mode, since then, as we've been waiting directives from the government. So, there's anxiety levels, there's questions and concerns, and people are wondering, when will I be coming back to work? And if you start to reopen and you're bringing back folks in a particular role, but not others, you just need to have really thought through the business needs and make sure that you're communicating that to employees so that it's viewed as a fair process. They may not like the fact that they're not the ones getting recalled sooner, but certainly they will be in a better place to understand who and how you're recalling employees back into the workplace. The other aspect about recalls, and we'll touch about it in another slide I have, is just thinking of your timing. And we'll also talk about some of the legalities of recalling people off of layoffs, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So there's another question here, continued of modified work arrangements, working from home, modified work arrangements, different shift schedules. As we come through COVID-19, I do believe that we will see things continue to change within the workplace. These are just my views based on my experience in different industries. I think whenever businesses go through a significant change, as everybody has done and is doing at this point in time, people start to rethink the nature of their business or the business and how they do business. And it may be that some of these work arrangements that you've put in place for COVID-19, you may want to consider retaining that once we come through, and hopefully we will come through COVID-19 to basically maintain that and offer that as a continued option for employees, as an example. Okay.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Ask a quick question, because I think it relates to what you've been speaking to.
Sure.
So it's just about the 10 sick days that was like brought forward last week. So if you're bringing someone back, is the 10 sick days that was promoted last week being put into place, or is it just currently up for discussion? Do you know?
Yeah, I think that's currently up for discussion because I know that that was being pushed for, because that had been on and off the table previously, right? So I believe that's sort of open for discussion. There is something under the infectious disease leave. That's a new leave, and there's a link I've got on that as well. That's just recently come into place to also manage folks when they come back, to give them another leave coming back off of layoffs. So I'll come back to the 10 days. I have not seen myself, so I'm happy to be corrected how that will actually be applied for sick days.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so think about the mechanisms that you put in place to raise any employee concerns around changes to work or business requirements, including work refusal. Okay, and I've got a slide, and I'll talk about work refusal in a minute or two, but it's possible that, I know I talked to a client, this was earlier on when we were hit with COVID-19, and they were looking at their business, and they were trying to figure out, who they would bring back, and there was a position and a person that they needed to come back, but that person didn't feel that they were they would be safe, in terms of coming back to work from a health and safety perspective. So we'll talk about that, but you need to be thinking about the possibility, particularly when you're trying to staff and you're trying to ramp up and get up to speed in terms of your workforce and your workforce planning. I think we've talked about changes to employee policies, and there's a link there for employment standards that we can, you can go back and you can take a look for any changes that have come up. But you may need to consider things like overtime. Clearly travel, business travel policy, there may not be any business travel, there may not be any overtime. Or the approvals and the requirements for that may need to be different because maybe you're running with a reduced workforce. I mean, you just need to really take a look at your business operations, your staffing, the policies that you have in place, and whether you feel you need to make any changes to that based on changes you've made to the business legislative requirements, or in terms of how you want to run your business going forward. A critical one is employee training. I think with all the new procedures and protocols and practices, that's kind of how I tend to look at them. So what's my process? How am I going to do things? It's going to go from here to here to here. What's the protocol going to be? Who's authorized, et cetera? And the practices of how we actually get it done. Things like self-checks, things like quarantines, things like returning to work. When you bring people back into the business and you've made changes to either their job or how they're going to get their work done, or changes to the physical space, and layout, etc., you need to make sure that you're also thinking about how you're going to, train up your employees so that as soon as they come back, they're ready to go. And they've got all the training that they need to be able to run the business the way you need it to happen. PPE, making sure that the PPE is available and ready. Maybe a question around, how are people going to get it? Are they going to get it when they come into work? Is it going to be in advance? How are they going to have access to PPEs and supplies? How are you going to manage that? Training them how to use PPEs. I've got a couple of links from Public Health Ontario later on in the deck that actually have some really good posters. There's a lot of really good material out there that you can use, and perhaps you put that up around your business just as reminders, visual reminders for people, but helping train them on how they need to hand sanitize, wear their mask if that's a requirement, or other PPEs. And a question whether they can take the PPE home or whether they need to leave it at work or whether they're bringing in their own PPE. All of those things you need to be thinking through. I'm going to talk about accommodation because I think, again, this is another area, and it might speak to these vacation days, or such say sick days, people requesting a need for accommodation. Accommodation generally falls under, both employment standards, but the human rights aspect. So it's those protected areas, things like disability, things like family status, those would be areas where I can see if we are not getting kids back into school, for example, parents have already, had to modify, their own work and their own need to provide, not babysitting as their kids, but need to make sure they're looking after their children, school-age children. So they may need more time if schools are not coming back in. So when you look at the demographic of your business, and by that I mean, if you look across your organization, and let's walk a very fine line from a human rights perspective, but employees generally are going to tell you, if they've got kids, etc., they may be coming forward and saying, look, I need some time out because I can't, there's no one to look after my child or children. So that's also, something you want to sort of be thinking through, perhaps dialoguing with employees, to work out reasonable solutions and looking at what's available, from a governmental perspective in terms of leaves and coverage. The use of technology, this is sort of, we've been talking about this so far, but using it for employee communications. I mean, right now, how are people communicating with their employees, keeping them up to speed on what's going on, providing them with updates? Historically, maybe you had team meetings at the end of shifts or beginning of shifts. What are your means and mechanisms for doing that? Business updates, just leveraging technology. So it's really about thinking through your how your employees are going to operate within the business based on the changes you've made from perhaps access, physical space, some of your policy changes. And I would say, in terms of keeping it fairly simple, it's really those things that impact employees, making sure they're aware of it, so there's no surprises and you have less chance for resistance, from a change perspective. When changes happen, people tend to be nervous and apprehensive and anxious. So I think from a business management perspective, the better you have thought through, the better you have, put a plan in place to be able to have the conversation and explain why the changes are made, what that means to the employee, making sure that they're trained, they have the tools, the means to be able to do the job, and managing some of that sort of apprehension I'm sure that people are going to have generally coming back into work, particularly with COVID-19. Okay. So I wanted to kind of pick out probably 3 areas that I'll talk through, in terms of layoffs and recalls. So in Ontario, layoffs are 13 weeks, temporary layoffs of 13 weeks up to a 20-week period. And this is what's prompted the most recent change from the government to invoke or add in this new leave for infectious disease, which is on a different slide, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. Businesses are starting to hit that 13-week, potentially hit that 13-week period. And under normal circumstances, if an employer lays off an employee, under a temporary layoff, over that 13-week period, they would then be liable for severance and other termination payments. But because COVID-19 is unprecedented, and this has been something I think that was raised right at the beginning, because nobody knows how long, potentially some of these restrictions are going to be in place, is how we manage what's currently in legislation for employment standards versus the reality of what's happening in the business environment at the moment. So the government has addressed that as recently as, again, I think it came into play May 29th. I'll have it on another slide, and it was just addressed yesterday. So I don't have a lot of information on that, but I will share what I do have, and it will be another leave that employees would be eligible to use, which would address both the employer and the employee concern around layoffs that potentially go beyond that 13-week period. So again, without knowing all the businesses that we've got on the call or the individual situations, you'd have to look at it really from a case-by-case perspective. That's something that's very recently changed. But what I've put in place here is what I would say is a very simple sort of 5-step process. So if you notify the employee of a recall with a specific date, so you should let them know today is the 2nd of June, I need you back to work on, let's say it's Monday of next week. Okay, you give them a specific date, put it in writing, that's best practice in Ontario, and you give them reasonable time to get ready for work. If I was to be called today and I'm told I need you there tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, chances are that's not going to happen unless I could make it happen, because it's I may need to organize kids, I may need to organize other stuff that I've got going on. Even though people have been off under COVID-19, you need a reasonable time. So you notify the employee of the recall with a specific date, put it in writing. That could be a text message, an email. As long as it's in writing, that's best practice. Give them a reasonable time to be ready to come back to work. And hopefully, if you have been talking with your employees throughout the layoff and keeping them informed and making sure they know what's going on in the business, they're going to be ready and happy to come back into work, with a reasonable notice period. You need to return the employee to a pre-COVID-19 layoff position. So let me explain what that is. If I was a store clerk, then when I come back, I should be coming back to my job. Okay, you need to return the employee from a layoff back into the job they had prior to them going off on the layoff. Obviously, if things have changed over time, that's a different conversation, and you would have to look at that case by case, understand why you've made changes, etc. But essentially, if I left in a position, I come back to the same position. Make sure that you're conducting any, and I've put in brackets, but it's all training, safety training in particular, but review their training, review any changes in policies or procedures, as they return to work, hopefully prior to, but if not, certainly when they come back in that first day or so, make sure that they're getting their training so that they are up to speed with everything. I'm also highlighting here, I call it a forum, but call them a mechanism or a means for questions and answers, right? Making sure that you're addressing concerns. In my experience from an HR perspective, I would say that the majority of issues that would have come across my desk, in terms of employee issues or concerns with their manager, is because they were not given an opportunity to raise a question or have a conversation or have a dialogue. And hopefully, and I'm sure that's not the case in any of your businesses, but I would say that is probably singularly the one thing that will probably kick off complaints and will, go south fairly fast if people don't feel they have an opportunity to raise their questions and have their address their concerns. And checking in with employees often, again, size of your business may make it challenging, but your leaders, whoever they can, making sure you're checking in. I think, we're all experiencing varying degrees of cabin fever or anxiety, or, this COVID-19 is dragging on. You hear a lot about mental health. You're hearing a lot about, how people are trying to cope. Maybe people are struggling to cope. And so making sure that you're checking in, addressing those concerns, listening to people will go a long way, I think, to being able to kind of get them in check sooner rather than later, and you know, stop something sort of festering and becoming a bigger issue for you. But on that recall, just, you know, the layoff allows an employer to temporarily stop paying a worker who's temporarily not working without triggering a termination. So that's the key. When you lay somebody off, you're not terminating them, you're laying them off temporarily. But if they go beyond, and this is where this has become an issue under COVID-19, and the government has addressed it recently in the last few days, we're starting to run into that 13-week period. In some cases, they may have exceeded it already with their work stoppages. And they needed a mechanism to make sure that they weren't putting employers and employees in sort of a situation of an unfair dismissal. Or constructive dismissal, I should say, and employers' duty to pay severance and other termination payments. So I think the government has been trying, you know, to keep on top of these things where possible and put things in place to help, you know, mitigate or reduce the potential impact for that. Okay, this is a bit of a crazy slide. I wasn't quite sure how to do it. So when you're looking at it and you get it after this session is finished, you know, it's kind of recent news. So I've been talking about this. So this new infectious disease emergency leave was brought into play May 29th. So that was Friday. And it's intended to provide employers and employees with coverage. And when I say that, it gives employers another mechanism to manage this issue of layoff and when they can bring people back in from layoffs without triggering a dismissal situation, which you would have if you don't come back after temporary layoff within 13 weeks, within a 20-week period. So this is one of the leaves under the employment standards that allows the employee to go on a leave that covers them. Similarly to other leaves, sickness absence leave, they would need to go in under this leave. And that would allow an employer to avoid the potential for constructive dismissal claims. You know, and the regulation has established that, you know, a temporary reduction or elimination of hours or reduction of wages during the COVID-19 does not constitute a constructive dismissal. And what that means is, you know, because we're running into these scenarios of where employers may only be able to bring people back for a reduced number of hours initially as they ramp up their business, or they're still off on a leave. Under the previous scenario prior to this new leave being put in place, there was a risk, right, of constructive dismissal claims. And so to address that, they've put this in place. And so this leave would be retroactive March 1st until the end of COVID-19. And obviously we don't know when that's going to end. So I don't really have a lot of information that I can share with you outside of what has been stated in the last couple of days that I've gathered off government websites or legal websites. You know, so there's a link that I've put in here, and this actually goes to the employment standards and human rights obligations around dismissal without cause. So you may still have situations where you need to let somebody go. This doesn't prevent you as a leader or a business owner from making those decisions. That's a separate conversation, but essentially if you still needed to, you know, dismiss somebody for either without cause or for cause, just be aware of the fact that you still be under your obligations from an employment standards perspective. But if you're in a layoff scenario and you're not going to be able to bring people back within that 13-week period, and it's going to extend, then this new leave allows you to be able to do that. I see you've got a few questions coming up, so I can either go to the end of this section and we can maybe capture all the employee sections. I've got another couple of slides and I'll do that. We can come back to it.
Perfect.
Or do you want to?
Yeah, you can just finish up the section.
Okay,
and then we'll
no worries.
all those questions.
Okay, because I expect we have a few for those. Okay, so work refusal. Again, I tried to look at, from an HR perspective, what are kind of going to be the top sort of hitters for want of a better word, that you might see more frequency of than you have previously within your organization or your business. And so we've talked about layoffs and the potential risk if you go beyond 13 weeks. Now we're talking about work refusals, right? So what I've put here is a very simplified process that you can follow or you need to follow when dealing with a work refusal. So an employee is entitled under occupational health and safety in Ontario, to refuse work that they believe is unsafe, or to be in a work environment in which they believe it's unsafe. So if the employee comes forward with a refusal to do work, then you need to document the reason for that refusal. And if the refusal is not related to health and safety, so they just don't like the fact that you've changed their working shift, for argument's sake, you've had to reschedule shifts, you've had to reorganize your workforce, and you're giving people a slightly different shift schedule than they had previously, that's not really health and safety. That's a different issue. You'd have to address that, but it's not really a health and safety issue. So if the refusal is not related to health and safety, and I'm going to put huge caveats on this because you would still need to look at it case by case, then a refusal to work is essentially considered that the employee has resigned. They're not going to work. They've essentially resigned. If the refusal is health and safety related, so they have a concern that the PPEs are not effective, or they are at risk of exposure, or whatever they may be coming forward with, then ideally at this stage, the employer and the employee would try to initially work together to resolve the issue, and the employee returns to work. Right? So if I came in and said, look, I don't feel comfortable, I don't think those guards are high enough, or I think I'm exposed to potentially, people who might have COVID-19 or whatever my concern is, then that's a health and safety concern. Certainly under COVID-19, it's heightened, that type of scenario. So as an employer, I would try and work with that employee. And if I have a health and safety person on staff, et cetera, bring someone in so we can try and resolve it ourselves. To the employee's satisfaction, mutual satisfaction, the employer returns to work. We carry on. But if the employee and the employer are unable to resolve their issue, then either party can contact the Ministry of Labor to conduct an investigation. And the Ministry of Labor then would make a finding on the complaint. And if there was a complaint, then, legitimate, then the employer would work to address the finding, and then they would have that reviewed again by the Ministry of Labor to ensure that they have become compliant, or they've done the things necessary to correct or address the situation. And at that point, if the Ministry of Labor does not uphold the refusal, meaning they're satisfied that the employer has taken the necessary steps to address the health and safety concern, then the employee at that point may also consider to have resigned, because there is no finding at that point that there is a health and safety issue. So, again, if you've got health and safety folks on the phone, happy to have further conversations, but essentially, we're talking about an employee who's refusing to work on the grounds of health and safety. And if the employee and the employer can work it out themselves, that would be the best case scenario. But if they cannot, there is a mechanism to bring in the Ministry of Labor, make a formal complaint, and then there's an investigation, and the Ministry of Labor investigates, makes a finding, and determines whether it's been addressed or not addressed. But if it has been addressed, then at that point the employee could have considered to have resigned. So I've included there's a link to Ontario's occupational health and safety that will talk about work refusals. But I think, again, as you're thinking about your business and you are reopening, as part of this checklist process, right, consider those things where people may have potential issues and concerns, and try and get ahead of it, right? Whether that's talking with the employees as part of the working solution, to set up the right things in place from the get-go, get them involved, or certainly have a mechanism by which you're going to hear and manage. You're required to do anyway under occupational health and safety regulations, but really getting ahead of it and being proactive, again, in my experience, is better than if you need to bring in Ministry of Labor And I think the other piece I'd add to this is the challenge is going to be, I know they've supposedly added more inspectors because of anticipating all the various issues related certainly to COVID-19. I can't even speculate how long it might take for you to get somebody in to be able to do an inspection, so and address your concern. So that's another point on that. I think this is my final slide on these three areas, and maybe we can come back to some of the questions, is accommodation. So what if an employee is requesting accommodation? This is under the Ontario Human Rights Code. I've supplied a link for that, and there's other items that are listed under Ontario Human Rights, but they are requesting accommodation. For example, maybe they have a physical disability, they're immunocompromised. They are somebody that has been advised they really should not be exposed or being in a situation where they could potentially be exposed. They're at a higher risk, excuse me, for contracting COVID-19. Then the employer works with the employee regarding accommodation. And this again is where this infectious disease emergency leave comes in, and I've added a link to that new leave that's been implemented where the employee would be able to go off on infectious disease emergency leave until they may be able to resolve the issue, or things come in place where they no longer feel they have a risk or a concern. The employer would have placed the employee on the unpaid leave during the accommodation, because typically those leaves, whether they're maternity leave, sickness absence leave, those are unpaid leaves that the employee is entitled to apply for. And under the government, we have a number of COVID-19 benefits or EI programs that are applicable and available to the employee who may be out on accommodation. The reason I put this out here is, again, I think just like some challenges with the layoff recalls and with the areas of refusal and also potentially accommodations, right? These are areas that you just may want to do a little bit of, if you're not already familiar with them, just familiarize yourself with some of the obligations, what's available to support you and the employee through those types of situations to make sure that you follow the correct process in managing them. And I've put this little caveat in here, just I think because, we're hearing a lot about people's mental health, and I don't want to downplay sort of the significance of that, but I think that's a whole other area that employers, going forward are going to continue and be dealing with as we work through, COVID-19. So it's just being aware of it. And also family status. I think that's another one of the protected areas under human rights where we could have some potential challenges, simply because if the kids don't go back to school, then you're dealing with employees who do not have childcare or the ability to do that. And that's going to be, another challenge. So I just called those out. I would sort of also underline a couple of other things anyway regarding, from an employee management perspective, is the importance of documentation. Making sure that you're documenting things clearly, the importance of sort of transparency and fairness, that you are listening to the concerns, you have mechanisms in place to address them. If you need, you escalate to the appropriate authorities and you manage them through the due process, or in some cases you may need to seek, legal advice, right, in particularly difficult cases, so that you're managing those and you're sort of, again, trying to get ahead of it. But documenting, and communicating would be two very, very key things in managing those types of situations. But I called out layoffs, work refusals, and accommodations because I think those are probably areas that you could potentially see slight increases, and being aware of that, having some thought behind it and mechanisms in place will help you manage that. Okay, I'm just going to finish this section on employees, and again, we'll come back to the questions. So workplace readiness employees. So I've been talking all the way through this section. For those of you that have, again, without knowing people's backgrounds and business backgrounds, we've all experienced change. And There is a lot of literature and information out there around change and change methodology. And what we're dealing with right now is just huge global change with COVID-19. And as a result, I think, again, in my experience, really being able to set, clear expectations, helping to manage engagement and motivation. It's about setting clear expectations, being open and transparent, sharing the plans, engaging people in the solution where possible. Don't feel like you've got to do it all on your own. Employees want and need to be engaged in solutions. So where it makes sense, get them involved. Allow them and help them to take ownership. That goes a long way to their engagement and their motivation. They're being part of that solution. Communication, it's two ways. Just as much as you're communicating out to them, you're being open to the feedback. Everybody's anxiety and stress levels, are going to be higher. And no one likes surprises, right? So nobody wants to find out this has changed and I wasn't told about it, or this expectation is now there and I wasn't aware of it, or I haven't had the training, etc. So when you're doing your checklist and you're thinking through your business, think through those types of things as well when you come to employees and consider what you might be able to put in place. In terms of allowing employees to be part of the solution, I've already talked to that, gives them some degree of control. Consistency. So again, in my experience, there's nothing more challenging or difficult when policies are not applied consistently. Employees will cry foul and unfair if they believe somebody got access or an opportunity or was given a different interpretation of a policy than they were. Some of it can be real, some of it cannot be, but the reality is it's perception. And so applying policies consistently, fairly, consistency in your decision making. If you're going to make decisions for one area or one thing, consider what the implications are across others, and also any discipline and action. It's a two-way street, right? Employees need to ensure that they are helping you provide a safe work environment and they're doing everything, to be a good, constructive, contributing employee. And if you feel, things are going off track, have that dialogue and try and get it back first. And if not, have the appropriate conversation. Lead changes, keep ahead of developments, stay informed. There's a lot of links in this document. I haven't opened them up just in the interest of not bouncing in and out between the internet and a PowerPoint, and it's staying informed. As I said, I just have found out about, this infectious disease, emergency leave that's come up, and that was just the beginning of this week, the end of last week, beginning of this week. So it's always changing. And celebrate the wins. I mean, that's another big piece. There's a lot of terrific work. We're seeing great stories out there of kindness and good work that people are doing. So celebrate the wins. Find ways that you keep motivated and engaged with your employees, and celebrate the wins. And then in terms of you and your leaders, this area, I'm talking about being kind to yourself, being kind to your leaders. Again, without knowing the structures of your organizations. Leaders sometimes feel that they have to have all the answers and they have to solve everything, and that's not always the case, because that can also contribute to stress and anxiety. Being able to recognize stress and anxiety levels, leaders are very often between that sandwich position, whether it's customers and employees or between employees, and so they need to also make sure that they're managing themselves. Find mechanisms to relieve stress. I've got a link in there. There's some things under public health, and I'm sure you've got your own that you do anyway, which is great. Just to relieve the stress when necessary. And again, celebrate the wins when you find those. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a minute and just, there were a number of questions, I think. Is it Courtney that were coming up there?
Yeah, so the first three I think are kind of all connected. So they're asking, is it mandatory that when an employee comes back, it's into the same role?
Okay, let me just make a note.
And then they're asking, so when they are recalled, they can then refuse to return and at that point request a leave. Is that correct? And if so, how does that process work?
Okay, okay, let's start with the mandatory same role. So under employment law, if you change my employment terms and conditions, and by that, there's a number of things that they use to test, right? So it's my rate of pay, it's the hours of work, it is, which is sort of my earnings potential, it's my position in the organization, right? Benefits, there's a number of things that they take a look at. So if you're going to bring me back into a different job than I did before, the question I would have for you to consider first that we take a look at is whether you've changed any of those core, core elements of the job, right? And so, we'd have to look at that in a case. But essentially, if you have, so if I was making, for example, I'll make it up, if I was in a position of leadership, use this as an example. If I was a supervisor or a manager, and you're going to bring me back into a non-managerial position where my salary, for example, will significantly decrease, the scope and role and responsibility is significantly different, right, between what I was doing and what I'm not, then that could potentially be viewed as constructive dismissal, right? So we want to be careful when we're bringing people back into different jobs. And the first question would be, what's the business reason for that? Why would we be doing that? Is it because the job no longer exists? Because that can be another conversation with the employee, because you can always have the conversation with the employee that says, look, we've had to make changes in the business. For example, maybe I can no longer operate this part of my business. So that part and that work and those jobs that were tied to that, depending on the nature of the organization, they've gone away. Right? So now the conversation with the employee might be, I have another job and another position that you could do, but here are the terms and conditions of that job. And then that employee has an opportunity to make a decision as to whether or not they would be willing to take that job, right? And if they do, then we document and we move forward. If they don't, then that's where you could potentially, need to be looking at paying out notification and severance. And you'd have to look at those sort of case by case. But generally speaking, if you're going to change my job, then there needs to be a business rationale, and there should be a conversation, and there should be an option for me as the employee to accept or not accept. And because you changed it and I didn't initiate it, then chances are there's some potential risk, and I put that out there because, again, you'd have to look at it case by case for owing that individual then perhaps termination pay, severance and termination pay. So that's sort of that mandatory same role. I don't know if there's a second part to that, but we can also, once this session is finished, if somebody has a specific question, we can go through that. The refusal and going off on leave. So let me just understand that again, Courtney. That is somebody who refuses to do work.
So if you recall, so you tell the employee that they would like you to come back, they refuse to return and request a leave. What is that process?
Okay, so first of all, if I have work for that employee and it is the same job, I've not changed the terms and conditions. I was I was an administrative assistant, pre-leave, pre-layoff, right? And you're going to bring me back into my administrative assistant role. So you've not changed my job, you've not changed my pay, etc. Okay. Then I guess the question first that needs to be asked is why that individual is refusing. So if they are refusing on the grounds of health and safety, so they do not believe that me coming back into work is safe, I feel it's not safe, then as I showed in the slide previous, then there would be a mechanism to address that. And while that's being addressed, that individual would be, would be on a leave off work, right? There's no leave, they've just been given a leave of absence from work while this gets addressed, okay? But if they still refuse, I guess the question is if they're still going to refuse after you've addressed it, that's a different scenario. They're not going to go take a leave of absence, or they're not going to take a leave of that point. They should they should be back to work. And if they're still refusing when that issue has been addressed, then from a health and safety perspective, we just put that caveat back in there, then they, they could be deemed to have resigned from their job. Okay, so if they are refusing for not a health and safety reason, I think I said that at the beginning. I mean, the question would be why? What is it that they're, if they're not happy with the fact that, I don't know, I've changed nothing in their job. I mean, they just don't want to come back. I can't think why, but anyway, they don't want to come back. And in that scenario, then, I would say at that point, you would deem the employee to have resigned. But I put big caveats around this because I think that we need to be very careful when we're talking about dismissals and terminations to have sort of the whole picture to understand that. But basically, there isn't a leave that I would go off on. I would request a leave if I need one, right? Like I need mat leave, or I need sickness absence, or I need a personal leave, right? I mean, under this new leave that's been implemented, and even prior, there were still sickness leaves that you could take. If the refusal is, look, I need to look after my children, I can't come back, then if they have not used a leave of absence for family, then they could apply for leave in that scenario. But again, I think we'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I know the childcare piece is one that we're hearing from a lot of businesses because it is a reality, right? And yeah, a lot of people are unable to return at this time just simply due to not having adequate childcare.
Yeah, and I think this is where the emergency, and it's so new, honestly. I was reading through it, and it's not been tested yet, from a legal standpoint. There's some mixed views out of Queen's Park, et cetera. So I would say stay tuned on that one. But essentially, if an individual under a protected area, they're now talking human rights, right? So family status, then in that scenario, I think, people, it looks like they are going to be able to say, look, I cannot come back to work. I am required to look after a minor, right? That's, cannot be left on their own. And that would be a protected status. And this is where I believe this infectious disease emergency leave would come to play.
Okay, great.
And what I'll do is I'll make a note of that anyway, because it's so new, and I'll just verify that. There's a couple of resources that I can go back and double check, but that sounds, from what I'm seeing, could be a new leave that an individual would be able to come back to. And I guess I also, sorry, just to close that out, I guess I'm hesitating a little bit on the terminology, right? A refusal is different potentially from an accommodation, right? I know it might seem like two very similar things, but if I refuse and I, the employer, have legitimate work and there's no health and safety risk, then there could be a challenge. I could potentially be able to challenge the refusal. If it's I need accommodation because I am unable to come back for something that would be protected under the human rights, right? And I've not exercised that, then this is where I may then be eligible in that scenario for a leave. I could apply then and request a leave.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I just want to clarify, like a refusal versus accommodation. They're kind of potentially two different scenarios. They might be connected, but somebody might say, I can't come back because I need childcare and nobody can do it for me, right? So I'm not refusing. I would love to come back, but I can't. I'm going to apply for this leave of absence that I'm eligible for.
And I just wanted to mention right here, if anyone is in a situation like this and they're not sure of the the legalities or like legally how they can proceed, we do have an employment lawyer who is taking calls on from clients of our office. So if you do have a question like that and you want to speak to an employment lawyer, please reach out to me and I'll connect you for sure.
Perfect. Yeah, because I think there's this new leave hasn't gone through any test yet, right, to see how it stands up. And I think COVID-19 is just presenting a number of challenges. And I think that's why they came out with the new leave, because we were getting to this layoff, potential constructive dismissal scenario for people that could be costly. You know, so I think we're seeing some of these things being, you know, put in place, and they're not tested yet. But if I refuse, why did I refuse? Is it legitimate refusal or resignation? Am I requiring accommodation? If it's accommodation, then there are mechanisms and leaves and policies in place. And I agree. Definitely, I would be looking at reviewing that with a lawyer.
Perfect. And the next question, Joanne, I might get you to resubmit because I'm not 100% sure what you're asking on this one. It has to do with if there is a second surge. And I think she's asking, should we be putting measures in place now in preparation for that? But I'm not 100% sure. So if you wouldn't mind just clarifying that one, that would be wonderful. And then we can touch base on it at the end.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so I'm just doing a quick time check. We got about a half hour, so I know we're getting through some of the questions, but I do want to leave some time. The next two sections that I have just to share with you is we're kind of, again, the whole intention today is just to think through your business, anticipate, try and get ahead of some of those things, you know, ask yourself some of these questions. There are lots of tools, lots of information that can help you do that. But just really thinking through your business as you're getting ready to reopen, okay? So third parties, this is just its own little section, right? So you need to also be thinking about third-party stakeholders, right? So are there any changes required with respect to how they're going to interact with your workforce? New delivery requirements or protocols? You know, maybe you're requiring them to wear PPE. In fact, maybe they are requiring your site to also ensure the safety and well-being of their employee, right? We're back into occupational health and safety requirements that were pre-COVID and still apply. We're also talking about customers. We're talking about suppliers and landlord. And I think, again, without knowing people's businesses, if you have a shared space, then if you have not already, you should certainly be sitting down with all parties and making sure that you align and come to sort of a common or shared agreement or understanding how you might need to manage some of those common areas, reception areas, elevator banks, things like that, so that everybody's sort of on the same page. So similar to the other sections, you know, will all third parties have access to your business, you know, going forward, or do you need to limit, you know, the access? What's the interaction going to be? Are we going to need to meet any new health and safety requirements by all parties? So you're going to require them to need to do things. We're going to require, you know, maybe our third parties to put some measures in place to keep our employees safe. So it's a mutual, you know, keeping folks safe scenario. And again, I gave the example of Costco, you know, from a customer perspective, who felt they did not need to follow the policy that Costco had put in put in place in the States, that all customers entering their premises need to be wearing a mask. That individual said, I'm not wearing a mask, and essentially was escorted or told to leave the site. So, you know, you could put PPE requirements in place, and it may be that your customer refuses, and you would have to then address that. So just be thinking through how you would need to handle that. Third-party training. So if you've changed how things need to be dropped off or delivered or picked up, you know, in your business with third-party delivery services, then you need to make sure they understand what those changes are, and everybody's clear, so there's no confusions, and you sort of eliminate any issues with that. You can also, again, as I've mentioned earlier, use technology, you know, and conduct your business, you know, and limit the need to be on site. You know, for example, we've seen lots of businesses getting very creative with customer orders online, and I'd said something earlier in one of the previous slides, and I'll restate it here for third parties. I think we're starting to also see interesting partnerships coming out of COVID-19 between businesses. I mean, they've perhaps always been there, but you know, a lot of restaurants that heretofore would not necessarily have done deliveries are now doing deliveries, and they're partnering up with these, you know, Uber Eats and Dash and all that kind of good stuff. You know, while there's a lot of potential challenges, you know, there may also be opportunities. So, you know, I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is how we are interacting with customers, which are part of our third parties, how we're interacting. So offering them other options and choices. And it may be kind of an interesting thing to look at as well. And I've already talked about if you have shared accommodations, right? You just need to make sure that you're all aligned. Okay, so communications. I've been talking about communications, I think, all the way through, the presentation or the workshop today. And it's really about what needs to change in terms of your messaging. How frequently are you messaging? What's your delivery format need to be? Is it email, website, poster? Some of the links that I've put in here that you'll get a chance to look at, there's some great poster material, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel on hand washing and PPE wearing and social distancing and mental health. You can leverage those things and use them for your business without having to rework stuff, but it gets the message out there that you need to get out. And you need to perhaps consider for your audience. So what do you need to be messaging to employees? What do you need to be messaging to customers, suppliers, and maybe the landlord, right? And suppliers could be delivery people, your cleaning staff, anybody third party, or people that come on site to fix and repair. Any individual that interacts with your business, you should be thinking through how you need to be communicating with them to keep them informed and make them aware of changes and ensure that they understand what you expect. Okay. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with setting up communications, but this is just a nice little reminder. When you're building out communications, consider your audience. It's what do they need to know? Map out your message. What do you need or want to say? And particularly if you want messages, consistent and repeat loud and often, that's sort of down there a little bit, you don't have to necessarily change the message. Just make sure that it's clear, concise, and you get it out to people regularly. Utilize language that's the what's in it for me to get people's buy-in. Why am I being asked to do this? So it's for my benefit. Wherever you can use that, that's always helpful. Less is more. Keep your message short and to the point. Be consistent. Again, that broadcast loud and often comment. The call to action, ask your employee for action. And we're asking all of you to respect our lineups or respect our PPE requirements or our changes in delivery. Whatever language you want to use around that, it's that call to action where you're likely to get people to engage with you. And everyone's a marketer. So if you have clear messages, clear things you want to say about your business, your audience is going to help spread your word. The other thing, and I did a post on my Facebook page on this, around, what is your message? What is the message you want to send out about your business? We are taking safety seriously. We have put in place protocols. We are listening to our customers. I mean, you'll find your own message that makes sense. You may already have some terrific messages that you're using out there, but people will read, they will listen, they will pay attention to those messages. And most importantly, they'll get those messages out there. And as many businesses are doing great things to be safe and all the rest of it as they reopen, it will not take much. It's like any scenario, right? It doesn't take much to lose a customer because they had a bad experience or they didn't feel safe, or, and the word gets around, about a business. So just think about how you can help get that message out, and that anybody who gets your message potentially gets to share it as well. So I'm almost at the end here, leaving us a bit of time. And hopefully as we've been going through today, it's prompting you to think about the things that you need to consider as you get ready to open up your business. I'm not expecting, all questions as part of the assessment to be in the materials that I've sent, but enough to sort of start you thinking about your own business and how and what you need to be considering as you get ready to open up, so that you do it in a manner that, the expression is sort of measure twice and cut once, right? So people don't want to start up and find they missed something and then have to stop and then restart again. So spending some of that time up front, this very well, I'm sure, will save you time in the long run. And getting ahead of some of those potential scenarios, like those recall questions, like those refusals for work, like those accommodations, or just even some challenging demographics. I've got a high percentage of people that will probably need some accommodation because if kids don't go back to school, I make it up, I'm losing half my workforce type scenario. Okay, so thinking through that. So this is really just a tying it together. So we've been talking through government directives, health and safety, employment standards, human rights, and I use the word common sense and judgment because you're all, I'm sure, seasoned, excellent business people, and you know, you exercise common sense and judgment. But at the end of the day, it to me, it really does. If we strip it all back, it comes down to common sense. We're asking people, you know, to be safe, to exercise some safety protocols, to limit the potential for exposure in order for everybody to be healthy and be able to sort of get our businesses and our economy and et cetera back up and running. You know, it's easy to say, difficult to do, of course, but you know, at the end of the day, that's really what any of these directives, mandates, and requirements are. So I sort of call that awareness bucket. So the links, the information that I've embedded, you know, that will give you additional materials that you can take a look at when you do have a moment, if you have a moment, you know, to help you build out your plan. And then in the assessment, I just put it into these 5 buckets. You could identify some other areas, but, you know, think of the physical space, think of your business policies and changes, think of how you need to manage your employees and training and make sure that they're comfortable, your third parties, right, and your communication plans and strategies. So this would be part of your assessment as you sort of build out your checklist for your business. And then, you know, the action component is the checklist plan, you know, checklist and plan for reopening. So if you understand what it is that you need to be doing, you need to be aware of the mandates and how you need to put it in place, then that's going to give you your plan, and that will allow you, hopefully, as I said, to be able to open up your business and reopen it, having well thought through everything so that you're not caught off guard and finding yourself in a situation where you have to shut down and come back up again, right? When you've already hopefully got some momentum behind you. And if your businesses that have already been open and hopefully you've been doing well, this may just be a refresher, or there may be some things in here for you to consider. And as I said, the legislation is changing regularly. So just that awareness piece might be the key for you to consider. So I've mentioned it before. I'll go through these very quickly because they're just links, but you know, I included Grey County. There's some great materials on there. Public Health Agency of Canada, Public Health Ontario, Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. There's a couple of really good links there. Ministry of Labor. So there's lots of material out there that I'm sure you have already been accessing, but if you haven't, these links should take you straight into things. For example, this one, physical distancing, that link will take you to the physical distancing poster and information. So it's something you could maybe utilize right away. Washing your hands, wearing a mask, cleaning and disinfecting. So there's some really good stuff there from Ontario. And then global resources, you know, keep thinking big picture, listening to what's going on in the world. We're hearing of new hotspots. We're hearing of second waves. Our numbers are where our numbers are, you know, so just being aware of what's going on. There's a link in there that is also aimed at helping you get your business ready for reopening. And then the CDC, there's just a number of links in there that you may, again, have already viewed, but they're good links and good information to add into your toolkit. And then if you want to talk further, if we don't get to all of your questions, I think Courtney, you said we'll be recording this and capturing it, then you know, happy to be available if needed, to talk through reopening assessment plans, or you need any help. And as we've said earlier in the conversation, I think some of the employee employment situations may merit you know, discussion, certainly from an employment lawyer. I certainly know enough, but I would defer very much to an employment lawyer on some of the potentially trickier cases to review, because I think some of this new legislation is exactly that. It's new, it's not been tested. And I think, you know, we're gonna have to see how it plays out as we go forward. Okay. And with that, I will end it here. And thank you very much for your time, for those of you that were able to stay on the line. And yeah, I'll make sure we get your information to you.
Perfect. Wendy,
Yeah.
are you comfortable sharing the PowerPoint with the link so that people can access them? Is that, or?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I sent you a deck this morning that has the links. I've checked them. They should all work. So if you send it to them as the PowerPoint, then the one I sent you. Yep.
Awesome. So I will share that out first thing tomorrow to everyone who participated today. So thank you everyone for coming. And thank you, Wendy. That was incredibly informative. There was tons of good info in there.
Probably a lot of information, and then that's the challenge, right? There's a lot, and it's changing regularly, so I totally empathize with head spinning, but I think if you can strip it down into some key areas, just make it as simple for yourself as you can. And like I said, I think best case scenario, a little bit of upfront planning and thought through your reopening action plan will save you time and hopefully not find yourself that you have to shut down and, right, because something got missed and then reopen again would be kind of
taking the time up front absolutely has value. Yeah,
exactly.
So just to let everyone know, we have 2 more sessions this week. We have a session on Thursday with 2 local accountants, so you're welcome to join us for that. And then there is a session between our Grey County, Bruce County, and Public Health this Friday at 2 p.m. Where Public Health will be taking questions about the phase 1 and phase 2 opening and what exactly is required for business owners versus what is being suggested. And it'll be a chance for businesses to ask very specific questions about their circumstances. So you can find both of those events on our Eventbrite page as well.
Perfect. Did we get all the questions, Courtney? Or are you going to send
I think we did. There was one, I think there was one that was asking about my office and how about second wave, but I wasn't able to clarify that.
Okay. Sure.
But everything else we did touch on. But again, as Wendy said, if you have any follow-up questions, please do reach out to myself or Wendy, and we will help you out.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming today. Appreciate it.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.